TorahCafe.com.
You know, they tell this story about a man who was working on a construction site, Jewish, but a self-proclaimed atheist. And he found himself suddenly slipping and dangling by the scaffolding. And at one point, he's desperate. He doesn't know what to do. So he looks up to the heavens and he says, listen, if there's a God up there, please help me. And a voice, to his utter amazement, suddenly booms back and says, do you believe? And he's shocked. He looks up, he says, well, okay, yeah, I believe. And the voice says, well, if you believe, then let go of the scaffolding with your right hand. And he says, well, come on, if I let go of the scaffolding with my right hand, I'm reducing my survival chances by 50%. And the voice says, do you believe? He says, yes. He goes, then let go of the scaffolding with your right hand. So he does. He says, okay, now what? And the voice comes back and says, do you believe? He goes, well, obviously, I'm only holding on now with one hand. He goes, good, now let go of the scaffolding with your left hand. And he says, hey, come on, who are we kidding here? He says, do you believe? He says, yes. Let go of the scaffolding with your left hand. The man pauses, thinks a moment, looks up to the heavens and says, listen, is there anyone else up there that I can talk to? So let me begin with a question. I don't expect an answer. In fact, I don't want an answer. I just want you to think about the question. What are you like when things go wrong? How do you cope with, if God forbid, you endure loss or adversity? Or what if things simply don't go your way? Do you despair? Do you throw in the towel? Do you cry out something like, Ma li velazot, what do I need all of this for? Or do you find yourself summoning the strength and rising above the challenge? Do you ride the dip and do you emerge triumphant? Just want you to think about this, and let's be honest, there may not be any one simple answer. You may respond somewhat differently at varied intervals, subject to the particular circumstances. But whatever it is, I want you to keep the question in mind throughout the course of this lecture. The story is told of Reb Zusha of Anipol, a great sage of the 18th century who had a custom every single morning, where after his lengthy prayer service and deep meditation, he would go into his office and he would open up the windows and he would cry out and say, Rabbi Shalom, dear God Almighty, Zusha is hungry. And every day, without fail, as if on cue, his attendant, his shamus, who would always be waiting outside, when he would hear that, would then walk into the office, the little study room, carrying a little tray with a little bit of cake and a glass of whiskey. And that's the way it went on week after week, month after month, year after year, until one day this attendant thought to himself, who is the man kidding? I mean, he's opening the windows, he's crying out, dear God, Zusha is hungry, and I'm the one who's bringing in the food over here, so why is he persisting with this kind of shenanigan every single day? He decided, next week, Monday, I'm going to teach him a lesson. I'm going to prove to him otherwise. And I'm going to make sure that when he opens those windows and he cries out to God that he's hungry, I will not respond. I'll just remain here outside. That's what he committed himself to doing. As it happened a little while later, somewhere on that Sunday night, there was a particular man who was coming into town, a visitor for business purposes, and it had been raining all night long. And this stranger who was coming into town notices that there is this huge puddle which he has to go across in order to be able to progress further. So he takes this very large log and he places it across the water and he proceeds to start walking. When all of a sudden he notices in the dark from the other side, a seemingly looking vagabond gets onto the other side of the log and he's thinking to himself, what a chutzpah. I mean, this is my log, I put it down here, I'm trying to cross, how dare he? But you know what? I'm going to have some fun. And so he proceeds to start shaking the log with his feet to and fro until he sees this vagabond fall off on the other side and land splash into the big puddle. And he makes his way merrily to the inn where he was planning to stay, and he meets with the innkeeper, and he's sitting down having a glass of whatever it was, and he's laughing about his immediate previous experience. And he's joking, and he's telling the innkeeper about everything that he had just done and how funny he thought it was. But the innkeeper didn't look as amused. He asked the visitor to describe what this vagabond, what this homeless man looked like. And When he did so, he said to him, and looked to him very seriously, he says, I have to tell you that Reb Zusha always tends to get up early before his prayer services to go to immerse himself in the mikveh at around this time in the morning. And from your description, the man that you made fall into that puddle was this great tzaddik, this great sage, Reb Zusha of Anapol. And this man, as you can well imagine, was seriously distraught. And he starts to cry and he starts to plead and he says, tell me, what is it I can do? How can I make amends? What do I do to go about rectifying the situation? And the innkeeper explained to him very simply. He says, every morning, the only time you'll manage to get a chance and an opportunity to see the Rebbe is every morning after his prayer services. He's there in his study and he has a little bit of a breakfast. So maybe right about that point, if you make sure you bring him in that breakfast, then that'll give you an opportunity to present yourself, to ask, to apologize, etc. Great idea. He does that right away. He gets ready a cake, a whiskey, whatever it is. He comes there. Meanwhile, Reb Zusha finishes his davening. And as is tradition, he goes to his room and he opens up the windows and he cries out and he says, Dear God, Zusha is hungry. The attendant is now standing outside with his arms folded thinking, now let's see what's going to happen. And then his jaw drops when, lo and behold, the stranger visiting town knocks on the door and makes his way in with a tray of cake and some drink to ask Reb Zusha's forgiveness. You see, the point is this. As much as this assistant thought that it was he who was providing Reb Zusha with his cake, with his whiskey, with his sustenance, it was God who was really delivering in one way or another. And the moral of the story is that if you believe, when you believe, God indeed will deliver one way or the other. It simply comes down to a question of whether you choose to attribute what happens, or even within this story, to coincidence, or whether indeed you recognize the divine hand in it all. Because I can tell you that from a faith perspective, even a coincidence is really just a miracle where God chooses to remain anonymous. Faith, it is said, is a pill that you swallow when washed in the waters of affliction. But more than that, it is a muscle that you use when rising to the challenges of life. What does that mean? Well, by definition, it's not something external. It's not something that is outside oneself. It's not something that you reach for from your medicine cabinet when you are in need. It's a muscle. It's something that's deeply engraved in the human heart and soul. Can you prove it? Not any more or less than you can prove to me right now that you have a brain. A professor told his class, none of you have ever seen God, none of you have ever touched God, none of you have ever smelt God, so we must conclude that God does not exist. Fair enough. One student got up and he says, may I, sir? And he then proceeded to walk to the front of the class, standing before the professor, and said, none of you have ever seen the professor's brain. None of you have ever touched the professor's brain. None of you have ever smelt the professor's brain. Therefore, we must conclude that Sir doesn't have a brain. Now, inasmuch, yes, you'll tell me you can do an MRI. You can readily discern that a person has a brain. You can marvel at the same time at the magnificence of this world, of creation, of a basic human being, and you can also readily conclude that God exists. You know what? Many people don't know this, but even Darwin acknowledged in a letter to one Asa Gray in the late 1800s that when contemplating the mechanics of the eye, it gave him a cold shudder. Why? Because it cast doubt on his whole theory of evolution. Ask yourself a simple question. Look at yourself and say, well, how many of you really know a thing about aerodynamics? Maybe some of you do. But most of us probably don't, and yet we still get on an airplane with full trust and full faith in the pilot, in the mechanics who built it all, and to one degree or another, the Wright brothers who made it all happen. Okay, so you'll tell me, yes, but the airplane has been tried and tested. I don't have to know how it works. I just know that it does because I've seen it work, or maybe even I've experienced it. And yet, sadly, every now and then, there is, heaven forfend, failure. But still, we get on nonetheless in the belief that it won't happen to me. So religion, I suggest to you, is also tried and tested. Just look at the enslaved Jews who survived Egypt, the persecuted Jews of the Roman Empire, the victimized Jews of the Spanish Inquisition, those who endured pogroms, crusades, the Holocaust. What do you think saw them through and kept them going? The only way that they could rise above their predicament and prevent demoralization was through faith. So were these calamities, were these terrible tragedies, these disasters, failures on God's part? Well, only as perceived by the naked eye, limited to the confines of time and space, you might be inclined to say so. But faith, again, necessitates that you see this as part of a bigger picture. And as we well know, the hard fact is that there are many, many who endured the depths of the hells, whether there or in the Holocaust, and carry on believing regardless. You can't explain that, but it's the reality of how faith, indeed, is not a pill you swallow, something you reach for from the outside. It's a muscle you flex. It's innate. It's part of who you are. You know, a woman once came to see me in my office when I was in a small community when I started out in England 20 years ago, in a place called Richmond, South London. And she came to sit and talk to me and to tell me that she doesn't believe in anything, Jewish though she may be. Now, of course, my initial thoughts are, though I didn't tell it to her, lady, if you don't believe in anything, why are you coming to tell me? You don't need a man of the cloth. I don't know, maybe a shrink or somebody else besides. But the fact is that she did come to me because any thinking, feeling Jew, as much as they don't believe, will be bothered by the fact that they don't believe, which essentially means that somewhere deep down, albeit a lot deep, they do believe, and they just want someone else to help them come to grips with that, to touch base with that. Some mentor to help them come to grips with it. Do you know there was a census done on a university campus in California a good number of years ago, where it was determined that a mere 2% of non-practicing Christians will still attend to their churches and whatnot on their particular festivals, holidays, and what have you. An overwhelming 84% of non-practicing Jewish students will still attend to their shuls on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Now, you'll go over to that Jewish student sitting in shul on Yom Kippur, and you'll say to him, do you believe? In all likelihood, he'll say to you something like, please don't confuse me with such questions, take it up with my rabbi. Then you'll ask him, do you observe? And he may well say to you, you must be kidding. You should have seen what I had for breakfast this morning. But then you'll say to him, so why are you here? And he will, in all likelihood, say to you, because God wants me to be here, that's why. And I'll ask you a question. Is that hypocrisy? It's not. It's what you would call subjective opinions to an objective truth. God is God, even if I don't believe, and a Jew is a Jew, even if he doesn't observe. That's the essence of faith. It's innate, it's intrinsic, it's part of your spiritual makeup and DNA. You cannot shake it off. You cannot rid yourself from it. And when you least expect it, at those most trying moments in life, that's when it surfaces and it envelops you totally and absolutely. Just look historically at the many so-called non-believing Jews throughout the course of history. When they were faced with the sword and the cross and they were told, you kiss this or this kisses you, how many of them suddenly found themselves giving up their lives? Why? Because it was their bottom line. It was something that was threatening the very core of that inexplicable but equally undeniable soul. And when challenged, they couldn't let that fire, that spark, however small, go out. And I asked this woman back in Richmond, who came to see me, were you ever in a critical situation, in dire need? And she thought a moment or two, and she was trying to consider, and she recalled how she was once driving with her husband down some country lane. And all of a sudden, he had this terrible asthma attack. And I said to her, what did you do? And she said, what do you mean? I pulled the car over carefully to the side of the road, and I immediately attended to him. I said, well, what did you do? She says, I took out his puffer, and I this, that, and the other. I said, let me ask you something. Did you find yourself saying anything at that point in time? Expressing yourself, verbalizing in any way? So she suddenly realizes, she said, I called his name many times, but she knows where I'm going with this. She was wondering whether I was, asking her, did you find yourself saying, oh my God, or something like that? And she was quick to say, well, I want you to know I didn't invoke God's name, if that's what you're asking me. But I did pray to my dead mother. And I'm thinking, lady, if there ain't no God, your dead mother isn't going to help you either. And this is my point. Isn't that part of the problem? People sometimes bend over backwards to just try to deny the undeniable. They don't see faith as a basic human faculty. They see it more as the absence of reason. Some people will be even more cynical than that, and they'll claim that faith is really just a sign of weakness, something that we resort to when everything else fails. In earlier time, the thinking goes, well, hey, faith was a necessity because man didn't have physics, science, and whatever else besides to help explain the laws of nature, the mechanics of everything else that goes on out there. But in now the face of reason and all of man's brilliant accomplishments, we have outgrown our need for faith. We're too mature for that kind of thing. Isn't it, after all, just a creation of our own imagination, simply meant to deal with issues that we cannot otherwise comprehend? And yet again, I say to you, as we've demonstrated, and as I'm sure you may well know in personal anecdote, we see that people inherently believe in something greater than themselves. We're born with it. It's not something that is acquired. It's not something that is taught. It's not a pill. It's a muscle you flex. It's our most natural state. We know there is a God, just as we know that we have a neshama, that we have a soul. The Mishnah tells us in ethics that every single day a voice emanates from Mount Sinai and calls out to us to connect. And the obvious question, as is asked by the great Baal Shem Tov, is, well, what's the point? None of us hear that voice. I don't hear it. You don't hear it. So why is the voice emanating? And the Baal Shem Tov explains our souls certainly do hear it. When you have that aha moment, as they call it, that sudden sense of inspiration. And I suggest to you that a very worthwhile exercise is to sometimes just pause wherever you are in the middle of the day. Stop what you're doing. Let your mind be silent and allow yourself to try and hear the small, still voice of God. Because when you relax, when you set yourself free, you'll realize that your faith is so much closer to the surface than you had imagined. Yes, again, we don't see our souls. We can't touch our souls, but we certainly feel the soul's effects. And I want to share with you 3 little personal tidbits to illustrate the point. I was on a lecture tour in Europe last year. My first stop was Barcelona. In true Chabad style, I was picked up half an hour late, and then told, again in true Chabad style, that we had to make a stop on the way home at a bris, at a circumcision ceremony. That's life in Chabad beyond time and always filled with spiritual detours. The father of this boy was hardly religious looking, okay? But when it came time to name his newborn infant, he gave the name to the rabbi, to the Chabad Shliach, with special emphasis, Chaim ben Harav David. And I'm looking at him. Harav David. Didn't quite look the rabbi type. But I couldn't help it. Afterwards, I went over to him. In fact, I noticed he had a Canadian accent. And I asked him, Harav David? And he said, Rabbi, I came to Barcelona to get away from that question. But since you're asking, I'll tell you. He went on to identify himself as actually having come from a very religious home in Canada, where he grew up, where he went to yeshiva, where he went on to get rabbinic ordination, then went to work for a particular organization, and that prompted him to have more questions than answers. And he dropped much of his identity, sadly divorced his wife, and made his way to Spain. He eventually got remarried to a nice Jewish girl, and here he was. This was their first child together. And he's getting visibly emotional when he's telling me this story. Where once shul was perhaps a daily experience for him, he wouldn't now normally be seen anywhere near there. But this is a bris. This is a circumcision ceremony. This is the covenant between every Jewish child and his maker. And no matter how far the drift, certain things still stick. Some things still speak to the soul. That faith suddenly surfaces. And that drew him out, such that if his child was now to be named, and he wanted to include that child as an integral part of his Jewish past, Harav David. 2 nights later, I'm speaking in Berlin to quite a large audience in this magnificent shul on the theme of finding God in a godless world, whatever it was. And afterwards, I was introduced to one young man who had the nails on his right hand polished and tattoos all over his left hand. And I'm later told that he comes from a very prominent Hasidic family in Israel. And he took off some years ago and he joined some hedonist camp in Germany where you get up to pretty much everything. There's no Rosh Hashanah in his life. There's no Yom Kippur in his life. But there are 3 big lectures that take place that they organize in Berlin on a particular specific Hasidic occasions. And he is always there without fail, sitting there silently absorbing. Why? Because that's what speaks to him. That's his faith factor. As his neshama, his soul goes in search for meaning. And finally, in Hamburg, the very next night, the crowd is somewhat smaller, but certainly much more interactive during the questions and answers, discussing and debating the whole subject matter. And I'm confronted with a barrage of comments from one particular person who's sitting in the front row. And it was the way he was asking the questions, the way he was agitating that reflected something more. And something about his breadth of knowledge revealed that there was more than meets the eye about this guy. And it turns out that he left his community in Williamsburg, New York, about 8 years ago. He wasn't tolerated because of his too many questions. He replaced his big furry streimel and his bekasha with a small kippah and jeans, and off he went. And he found himself a nice Jewish girl in Hamburg, and now he has found his level, as it were, where he helps out, he does the Torah reading on the Shabbos, and so on and so forth. These are Jews who left their roots, but find a place to come back. Find an experience that touches their neshamas, touches their souls individually, and invariably draws them out to return. Even as we don't see the soul, we sense its continuous hunger for meaning, its thirst for knowledge, and then we feel satisfaction when we properly nourish it. And with that in mind, my issue, therefore, is this. Why do people choose to treat faith different to that of everything else? Science is never exact. Science is not absolute. But we accept within reason its conclusions. You can challenge scientific conclusions. You can hold it up to scrutiny. But where you don't have categorical evidence to rebuff it, you accept. That's the reality of our world. And yet when it comes to religion, when it comes to faith, people choose to be altogether different. Religion shouldn't be treated any different. By all means, hold up the imperial truth to scrutiny. Feel free to challenge. No one says you have to accept blindly. Not in Judaism anyway. The verse says, V'yadaita hayom, and you shall know today, v'hashevos elavavecha, and you shall turn to your heart. And you shall know today is the intellectual dimension of Judaism. Knowing, knowledge, intellect, where you seek and you explore and you challenge and then you discover. And you shall turn to your heart, that's the emotional side of Judaism. Cardiac Judaism, if you like. That common mantra, I'm a Jew at heart. And both are essential for a meaningful religious experience. Just don't start from a default position of assuming it to be flawed or opium for the masses. But let me be clear. I'm not saying that we can't have doubts. Harboring doubts is not necessarily a bad thing. But you do have to be honest enough with yourself to consider where those doubts are coming from. Because to my mind, there are essentially two types of doubts. There is doubt that is based on rational query, a doubt that comes from your subjective motives and your limited understanding, which is fair enough. And then there is what you might call irrational doubt. That doubt that is simply there because you want to rebuff. You want to mock, you want to reject, you want to neutralize those most convincing arguments with a very cynical, closed-minded approach. I found myself last year sitting opposite that militant atheist and author, Richard Dawkins. Have you heard of him? And we were in a televised debate. Actually, he wasn't supposed to be part of the debate, but he was brought on as a special guest in the interval. And all of a sudden, he's putting out all of his stuff over there. And yet, for all of the arguments that he put forth on trying to refute the existence of God, it came down to one ultimate counter-argument. But, Professor Dawkins, for all the arguments that you put forth, you have not categorically demonstrated that God doesn't exist. Is that correct? He says, yes. So the possibility remains that he might indeed exist, right? He says, well, yes. So that was the extent of the brilliance of the argument. You see, truth can refute logical arguments. Truth can even prevail over subjective opinions, so long as the one who's harboring those doubts, as the questioner, is committed to listening, to hearing what is being said. When true words are spoken, the honest man and woman will then be open enough to hear it, and that's good. But all of the rational arguments are futile and totally powerless against the challenge of somebody who just simply brazenly looks to mock that truth and with nothing more than a dismissive shrug of the shoulders and a yes, so. So then the question, of course, is this. Well, if that is the case, then how come more people don't indeed believe? A writer once came to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and asked that very question. He says, why is it that so many people seem to have difficulty believing in God? And the Rebbe looked to him and said, there may be doubts, but to question God, however, is the first indication that you believe in something. You have to have some acceptance of God even to question him. So the man says, well, okay, in that case, if they believe, why don't they act on it? To which the Rebbe then replied, and perhaps we can all relate to this on one level or another, they're afraid of their faith. They fear the demands that their faith might put upon them, that they might have to forego some of their comfort or compromise some of their ideas. They fear changing their lives. You know, sometimes the first step in the search for faith might be to assure yourself that you're ready to listen and to grow, and that you're prepared to embrace the responsibility that comes with faith. There was a very curious episode relayed in the Torah where Moshe dares to turn to God as he watches his people suffering, and he cries out, Lama hara'osa la'amazeh, why do you allow evil to befall your people? My God, why have you done bad? I'll ask you a simple question. Was that chutzpah on Moshe's part? Isn't that, after all, a failing on Moshe's part to dare challenge God like that? Some of the commentaries will have us actually believe so. Chaval al da'avdim v'lo mishtachim, woe is it about what we once had, says God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who accepted unquestioningly, and now who's no longer there. In other words, some are actually suggesting this is a criticism of Moses. Indeed, some suggest that this story, this episode, is relayed in the Torah to teach us that, hey, don't feel so bad if you have doubts. Even great men like Moses can experience moments of despair. Hasidism tells us, no way. That's not a failing on Moshe's part. On the contrary, it is an act of faith of the highest order. Because it's only when you truly believe that you will then have the conviction to cry out, "Dear God, why have you done evil to your people?" When you don't believe, well, frankly, there are no questions. What are you going to be angry at? What are you going to be upset with? The negative happenstances of our world? And what are you targeting your upset and your distress at? This happened to you. Tough luck. Darwin was right. Survival of the fittest. Elie Wiesel, who endured the depths of hell sitting in the pit in Auschwitz, summed it up, to my mind, most beautifully. You can either love God or you can hate God, but you can't ignore God. And I think by definition, if you use the concept of human challenge to deny the existence of God, that's a logical absurdity. In fact, I'll go so far as to tell you that I think it's extreme arrogance and conceitedness. It's like saying, if I can't understand Einstein's theory of relativity, then it must be flawed. It doesn't exist. It doesn't follow logically that my inability to comprehend means that it's all wrong. So, hey, I can be upset, I can be frustrated, but I cannot deny the reality. That would be an emotional response, which is fair enough, no one's to judge, but it's not a rational response. So you can love God, you can have faith and accept irrespective, if you're strong enough. Or you could be angry with God. You could be frustrated as to why me. But logically, rationally, intellectually, whatever brought you to the acceptance of His reality in the first instance, whatever prompted you, whatever motivated you up until this point to embrace His reality cannot be rejected outright in the face of whatever adversity. And yet here we have to go one step further as well. Because even when you do believe, you may not be convinced that God is really bogged down with the nitty-gritty. You may not believe that He's actually genuinely responsible for all that transpires in the world. Yes, He set the wheels into motion. But now, they roll where they may. Does He really care about how I feel or how I'm coping with my individual crisis? But the real faith, as demonstrated by Moshe, means that you know that everything happens only because it is ordained from above. If you believe in God, in His omnipotence, in His omnipresence, then that suggests perfection. If God is imperfect, then He's limited, then He could be terminated, then frankly He isn't God. If God is perfect, then He can do no wrong. And though through our limited human minds and understanding, we might well perceive that something is wrong or unfair or unjust, ultimately it isn't. And if God is involved, then make no mistake about it. He hears my cries. He hears Moses crying out to the heavens, and He cares. Hence, we can dare ask, "Dear God, why have you done evil to your people?" So here's the million-dollar question. Well, okay, fine. So I can ask. I can have faith, and I can ask nonetheless. I can believe, and I can challenge nonetheless. I can cry out, and God listens, and God hears, and God cares. Really? So why doesn't He answer? Well, there's a couple of points to consider here, perhaps more than any other. In his farewell speech to the people of Israel, Moshe lets them in on a little secret. He confides in them the following. Vo'etchanan el Hashem ba'esahi lemar, he says, I cried out to God. We know that Moshe was denied entry into the land of Israel. And here he's telling the people, I want you to know, I implored God to let me into the land of Israel. And the commentaries observe that the numerical value of that word, vo'eschanan, and I pleaded, is 515, alluding to the fact that Moshe himself prayed 515 times, as he's now revealing to the people, asking God, please let me in, please let me in, please let me in. You know, even when you do believe, and you therefore pray, after a while, you might be inclined to give up. 515 times over and again is like a child who believes in the parent's ability to grant the wish and persists incessantly in the hope that mom and dad will relent. But that's not where the brilliance of Moses' faith lay. It was the number 516. The same commentaries who tell us about the numerical value of 515 also observe that had Moshe gone the extra mile, had he prayed, had he asked that one more time, then his request would have been granted. And you know what? In all likelihood, Moses himself was well aware of that, which would have surely made him wonder why God didn't yield sooner. If only because as much as one could evoke divine compassion, and yes, maybe in the process alter destiny, the true believer appreciates that your prayers are always answered, albeit that sometimes the answer is no. Now that's a very hard pill to swallow. It's hard to accept. It's sometimes very frustrating. But again, that's where faith comes in to alert you to the reality that you find how sometimes people everywhere pray for somebody or pray for themselves or whatever it is, and yet still it doesn't quite happen the way you had hoped. Does that mean your prayers weren't answered? No, but you just don't understand the bigger picture. It's just simply that the answer was no. So Moshe teaches us something very important, something that we should look to integrate into our own daily lives when it comes to faith. We should speak to God. We shouldn't hesitate to confront Him, to ask Him, to challenge Him. Moshe teaches us that passive faith, laudable though it may be, is for sissies. The real believer invites God into the ring saying, "Come on, God, bring it on, you and me, one-on-one." And to be sure, Moshe was not the very first to react in this way. Several centuries earlier, our forefather, Jacob, indeed grapples with the angel and prevails. And then, what does he do? He says to the angel, "What is your name?" Why does Jacob care as to the angel's name? And the better question, perhaps, is why on earth does the angel act in typical Jewish style by answering a question with a question, saying, "Why do you ask my name?" What is really happening here? You know, what is a name? A name reflects the essence of something. Jacob represents the Jewish nation throughout the millennia. The angel is the angel of Esav, hence representing the embodiments of all the evil forces and all the struggles that we have had to endure from time immemorial. Jacob is looking to understand this perpetual struggle. What is your name? What are you all about? Why? And the angel answers very ambiguously, "Why do you ask my name?" As though to say, there'll always be questions that are beyond human grasp. Try as you may, you will never be able to properly fathom the underlying reason for everything as it transpires. So what both Moses and Jacob demonstrate is that a key component of faith is the balance between acceptance that we cannot know enough to comprehend the answer and the conviction to believe and care enough to ask the questions. As per that well-known anonymous prayer, "God, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to tell the difference." Maybe actually faith is best exemplified by that story of a young man, a real schlemazel, who became very, very religious, super religious, much to the dismay of his in-laws. I mean, they had so many arguments about it, especially as he chose to drop out of the family business and just sit and learn all day. And every time his father-in-law would confront him, he would say, "Don't worry about it. God will provide. It'll be okay." And of course, they're getting deeply concerned over the period of time. And every morning, this young man would stick his head out the window and he'd say, a bit like Rabbi at the beginning, "Praise the Lord, I believe God will provide." And his in-laws living next door would scream back, "Shut up, there's no Lord, keep quiet, stop believing." Now, before long, this guy is broke and he's undeterred. But still, his in-laws are somewhat concerned about their daughter. And so they decide one day, at the very least, they're going to take a big box of groceries and drop it off on the doorstep. And the man puts his head out the window again. Sure enough, the next morning he cries out, "Dear God, God is great. I believe God will provide." And then he looks and lo and behold, there is a box of groceries. And he cries out and he says, "Dear God, God is great. God has delivered." And the father-in-law can't take it anymore. And he comes running over with the receipt from the grocery store in his hand and he says, "You fool, God delivered nothing. I went out and bought these groceries." And the man looks and he thinks and he looks up to the heavens and he says, "Dear God, God is even greater than I thought. Not only does he deliver, but he gets the devil to pay for it." You know, in light of our own challenges today, each of us face our own demons, inner, outer. What we need to do, you and I, is bolster our spirits and vanquish our fears by discovering the freedom of our neshamas, of our souls, as experienced through faith. And what that really means is that one ought to always feel reassured and convinced that if God got you to it, God will get you through it. And if sometimes you don't know why, that means that as far as God is concerned, you can manage even in the absence of the answer. By all means, search, explore, ask, challenge. Only then, don't be afraid. Be honest with the conclusions that you arrive at. But then there's something beyond faith as well. Something that's so much more compelling, so much more powerful. Here's a simple question to think about. You know, we speak about the God of Abraham. His righteous memory is conjured up during the most auspicious times. He's the first of the forefathers, the original Jewish superhero, if you like. And yet I wonder to myself, what is so great about Abraham? That he had faith? Lots of people, even back then, surely had faith. That he responded to the tests of God and rose to the challenge? I'd like to think that if God appeared to you and me and ordered us to jump, we would simply ask, how high? Abraham the faithful. Why? What's the big deal? Here we go, one very critical step further. Because the Hebrew word for faith is emunah. That is, like we've just discussed, at the core of every Jew, even if it takes for something more to challenge it and to cause it to rise to the fore. So what is it that's so great about Abraham? Well, there's something more than emunah. It's called bitachon. Whereas emunah means faith in God, bitachon means trust in God. And what's the difference? Well, faith alone can be, like we said, a passive state. You believe that God can change an impossible situation for the better. Trust is not just that things can get better, but that things will get better. Trust is not just being at peace with any given situation because I trust in God and I trust His plan. That's fair enough. But trust is actually the certainty that you can change destiny. It's the absolute conviction that goodness will prevail and that we have the power to make it happen. And I want to share with you a beautiful story that really illustrates the point. There was a Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Lifshitz, living in Alabama many years ago. Jewish population, I don't know, say about 7,000. Jewish maximum prison population, 42 or more. And Rabbi Lifshitz found himself spending more time with the susceptible Jews in the Alabama State Penitentiary than perhaps with the wider community, particularly on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's where he would hold his minyan. I don't know, maybe he had a better chance of getting a minyan there. But there was that moment on Yom Kippur, just before Ne'ilah. And he spoke to them about the importance of Yom Kippur, about life changes, about the meaning of undertaking a resolution for the coming year, and what better a moment than now. And so they go into Ne'ilah and they finish the prayer services, and afterwards everybody goes to break their fast, and one inmate, Carl, is still sitting there. He says, "Carl, why are you still here? Everyone else went to eat." Carl says, "Rabbi, I need to ask you, what is Shabbos?" He says, "Why?" He says, "Well, you know, you told us to undertake a resolution. We all had that moment of thought and silence. That's what I undertook. I got a general idea, but I need to know more." And the rabbi thinks to himself, Shabbos, prison, doesn't quite go well together. So he honestly said to him, "You know what, maybe pick something else." He says, "Rabbi, I did my crime, I do my time, but my word is my bond. I undertook Shabbos. I want to know what it involves." So the rabbi explained to him in as basic a detail as he could about what Shabbos involves and what it entails, and then promised that when he would go home, he'd send him some books on the subject that he could read up on. That was in the days before Amazon.com. So when the rabbi did go home, the only book he had on his shelf was from Rabbi Eider. Rabbi Eider You published a whole series of different books, which are very technical. You need to have a good 5 years of yeshiva just to make your way through the nitty-gritty of the terminology. But that's what he had, and he made a promise. So he took his first volume and he sent it off to the prison for Carl. And about a month later, when he came back to the prison for his monthly shiur, Carl isn't there. And he makes one of two immediate assumptions. Either Carl looked at the book, saw the nitty-gritty, the technicality that is involved in thinking, my God, if that's Shabbos, I don't want to have anything to do with any of this, and decided that was it. Or maybe he just simply felt too embarrassed to turn up. But what the rabbi did subsequently determine is the following. Carl read the introduction to the book, where the rabbi is talking all about, the author is talking all about the importance of Shabbos. And the rabbi quotes in the introduction that famous Talmudic passage, Ilu Mishamrin, if the Jewish people would only keep collectively 2 Shabbatot, they would be immediately redeemed. And Carl thinks to himself, well, hey, if that's the way it can work for the people collectively, how much more so can that work for me individually? So I'll keep Shabbos. Doesn't know quite how, can't make his way through the book. Well, there's one good sure way to do so. You sit on your hands and you do absolutely nothing. And that's exactly what he did. You know, at that point in time, the United States government was looking to introduce the tagging system, to take very low-risk criminals and allow them out. And they were going to select just a few for that first all-initial experiment. As true as I stand here now, on that second Shabbos, or just after, Carl was called into the warden's office and told that he was going to be one of those to be used for that initial experiment, to have the tag and to be allowed out. And I think what that story demonstrates so powerfully is that Carl didn't have emunah, he had bitachon. He didn't just hedge his bets, he somehow felt and knew with absolute conviction that it was going to work out for the best and that he had the power to make it happen. And frankly, that's the uniqueness of Abraham. He maintained a constant level, the first ever, of bitachon. He didn't just believe that every test that he was facing was going to work out okay. God will provide. He knew at every juncture, from his inability to conceive at an old age to sacrificing his son, not just that goodness will prevail, but that he had it within him to alter destiny. Remember, always remember this. It's not so much what you believe in that matters, as the way in which you believe it and proceed to translate that belief into action. Leap, and the net will appear. When I was in Toronto just this past week, and I overheard people wishing my father well, they would typically be saying to him, all should be well with you, im yirtzeh Hashem, which translates to mean, if God should so will, or as we tend to often say, God willing. And I noticed every single time my father always responded, be'ezras Hashem, with the help of God. And I'm thinking to myself, what's the difference between the two? And then it occurred to me. When you say God willing, well, you're giving God options, as it were. That's faith, leaving it in his hands. When you say with the help of God, then frankly, you've narrowed it down to one. It will be good, and God will surely see to it that it will be so. That's bitachon, that's trust. There's an age-old Hasidic expression, tracht gut wird sein gut. If you think good, then it will be good. What does that mean? If you think positive, if you have faith, if you have bitachon, then yes, you can alter destiny. You know, the saddest day on the Jewish calendar, of course, as we know, is the 9th of Av. It is the day in which our temples were destroyed and we endured exile. Indeed, as we find ourselves up until present day. But let's look at the day in historical context. In the Torah, we read that tragic episode where the spies come back from the land of Israel and they declare that there's no way that we can go into the land, and immediately they throw the people into a tailspin. They become totally discouraged. They start bemoaning their fate, and they cry and they cry and they cry. And we know, of course, the end result of which is that they die out over the span of the next 40 years of wandering in the desert. You'd think that was enough. They bewail their alleged threat of the land. Fine. They can't go in. If it's not good enough for you, then you won't go in. If you lack the conviction, then it's not for you. But the punishment doesn't seem to end there. the Talmud tells us that as the Jews cried that night, in effect for no reason other than baseless faithlessness, God says, I will give you reason to cry in future generations. That night was the 9th of Av. In 1312 BCE, that's when the episode of the spies occurred. In 421, on the very same night, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the first temple, during which over 100,000 Jews die and everyone else is exiled. In 70 CE, that's when Titus led the Romans into Jerusalem and destroyed the second temple. So many more died. Countless others sold into slavery. In 132 CE, that's when the massacre at Beitar took place. In 1095, Pope Urban II declared the First Crusade, and we know that thereafter also in 1492, that was the culmination of the Spanish Inquisition with the expulsion of the Jews, and in 1914, on the eve of the 9th of Av, World War I broke out, paving, of course, the way for the subsequent Russian Revolution and ultimately World War II. All these ineffable events transpired over a span of more than 3,000 years, each commencing or culminating on the 9th of Av. Why? Because Jews cried on that all original night for nothing, and God said, you cry for no reason, I'll give you reason to cry. I ask you, is that a measured response? Is that the consideration with which we describe God as being all compassionate and slow to anger? Of course, today we mark the 9th of Av through a 25-hour fast. There is one other, as we know, 25-hour fast, and that is Yom Kippur. How did that come about? Did God randomly spin a wheel and 10th of Tishrei? Good, that's going to be the Yom Kippur. Best day for atonement. No. Let's pause again and reflect on historical context, what led up to that day. The Jews received the Torah at Sinai on the 6th of Sivan in the Jewish year 2448. The next day, Moshe ascends heavenward. When he comes down, of course, on the 17th of Tammuz, and he finds them worshiping a golden calf, he breaks the tablets. And eventually, when he goes back up again on Rosh Chodesh Elul, he comes down 40 days later on the 10th of Tishrei, where God has now granted forgiveness to the people. And henceforth, that day is known as Yom Kippur. And the point is this: there are dates, and there are times, and there are days, and there are intervals in our lives that can go either way. There are circumstances that we confront daily, whether within our home life, whether within our workplace, wherever else, that can go literally one way or the other. But we are the makers of our own reality. We are the architects of our destiny. And it's the precise mindset that can sometimes make all the difference. I suggest to you that had Moshe not prayed for the people to be spared from divine wrath, had he not then come down on the 10th of Tishrei with a second set of tablets, then there would not have been a Yom Kippur. Then we wouldn't have that greater opportunity every year with which to make amends. And it's precisely because he took advantage of the opportunity, he exploited it for positive purpose, that God demonstrates his compassion, and as a result of that, the day becomes enshrined as one of atonement for future generations. And it is precisely in the same vein that I suggest to you that it's not that all the negative and the tragic experiences endured by the Jews throughout the ages on the 9th of Av were some protracted punishment for that all original sin. It's that our attitude, our crying, our lack of faith attributed a certain kind of extreme negative energy to the day, resulting in a domino effect, enabling other destructive events to occur on the same day as well. Indeed, when God analyzes the event with Moshe and talks about the consequences of the spies, he said, because the people rebelled against me, lahotzi diba al haaretz, to speak about the land. And Rashi, that commentator par excellence, observes curiously that the word diba is an unusual word which means language or words that can go either way, whether good or bad. And I think what he's trying to tell us is that even the way we think or the way we speak has a very real and direct bearing on the outcome. Trach gut, if you think good, if we have faith, if we do trust, then bet sein gut, it'll surely be good. V'haboteach b'Hashem chesed yosef avenu, he who trusts in God, God will encompass him with kindness. By definition, man is attached to the object of his thought. If you think negative, and sometimes we can't help it, then you become attached to the negative. And God forbid, judgment can cleave. But you're in control of your own thoughts. And if you believe in divine compassion, if you tell yourself and you commit yourself to believing that it will be good, then you'll attach your soul to God's chesed, to God's kindness. And that chesed, that kindness, that benevolence will encompass you. Anxiety and fear is natural and it produces energy, but where we focus that energy noticeably affects the quality of our lives. That's why, after all, even that saddest day, the 9th of Av, has a paradox. You don't say Tachnun on the day. Why? Because we're told that it is also the day in which the soul of Mashiach was created. Life is a grindstone, but whether it grinds us down or polishes us up depends on us and the level and the extent of our faith. What is the surest way to determine your level of faith? How do you know where you're at? How do you know where your emunah, where your bitachon is at? Look at your own disposition. This comes back to my all-original question. When you're faced with difficult situations, or generally as you walk and coast through day to day, are you happy or are you sad? Are you in a state of constant worry, or do you have some peace of mind? As the Tzemach Tzedek once wrote to someone, it's important to be cheerful at all times, because then you will be shown cheerfulness and favors from above. Even when things seem bleak against the odds, yes, we need to summon the courage, the faith, and the fortitude, because that alone can make all the difference. So let me just conclude with this final anecdote. 3 men are hiking, and they unexpectedly come across this large, raging, violent river. They need to get to the other side. They're desperate. They have no idea how to do so. The first man looks to the heavens, prays to God, and says, I have faith. Please, God, give me the strength to cross the river. And poof, God gave him big arms and huge muscular legs, and he's able to swim across that river, albeit in about 2 hours, and almost losing his life a couple of times. So seeing this, the second man turns and says and prays to God, I have faith. Give me the strength and the tools to cross the river. Then poof, God gives him a rowboat, and he's able to row across the river in only about an hour, but again, also almost after capsizing several times. The third man, seeing how this worked out for the other 2, also prays to God, and he says, I have faith. Please, God, give me the strength and the tools and the intelligence to cross the river. Poof. God turns him into a woman. She bothers to look at the map, hike upstream a couple of 100 yards, and walk across the bridge. Sometimes we get too involved, too caught up in our own crises and our own dilemmas and what goes on in our life that we suddenly get blinded by the reality that's there before us. We lose perspective, even as the solution is right before our eyes. Tracht gut, wird sein gut. That is the essence of faith, of bitachon. Positive attitude will move you on through life more easily. It'll bring resolution more quickly. Life lessons don't always come packaged the way we expect them to, but they're the lessons that ultimately bring us the greatest satisfaction. And your dreams, they're only blocked when you allow your fears to grow bigger than your faith. If you keep your dreams alive, you understand that to achieve anything requires a belief in yourself and a faith in the one above, and that will bring all possibilities for those who believe. Those struggles in your heart, they're natural. They're perpetual challenges that we face on an almost daily basis in one form or another. You could be honest enough with yourself, at least to explore again, to search, to discover, to listen to that voice of your soul struggling to rise above the din of the grind. And then take it from there to the next level of full trust, of conditioning yourself to always think positive, which will invariably impact on your psyche, on your consciousness, on your whole disposition. And then, by extension, it'll transform your reality. Because in a world that is filled with causes for worry and anxiety, we need the peace of God standing guard over our hearts and our minds. A sane, wholesome, practical, working faith is that it's man's business to do the will of God, and that God himself takes on the care of that man, and that therefore a man ought never to be afraid of anything. That was the thinking. That was the mindset behind Reb Zusha. That's the surest way of getting your cake to be delivered to you every single day.